Yes, I think it's almost 10 o'clock, so I have a little bit of talking points to do before we delve into our discussions.
Okay,
All right,
wonderful,
so
wonderful.
yeah, so let me go ahead.
Sure.
Hello and welcome to this edition of the Sankofa African Webinars brought to you by Bell Associate Consulting Limited. My name is Benjamin Akwe. It's August 30th, 2024, 10 a.m. US Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Ghana time, GMT, 3 p.m. Nigerian time, and 5 p.m. Kenya time. Today's discussion topic, Africa's development strategy, prosperity of illusions or extreme poverty of reality. The discussion topic forms part of Sankofa African discussions on U.S. strategic objective of development towards sub-Saharan Africa and the African Union Agenda 2063. So Bell Associate Consulting Limited, in collaboration with Budget IT, Ghana have used this platform to bring together experts from the United States, the African diaspora, and the African continent to discuss the economic, political development, and security challenges facing the continent. So in previous discussions on U.S. government strategy, the U.S. has what they call 3D strategy, what they call diplomacy, defense, and development. And the Biden administration strategic objective towards sub-Saharan Africa. Some of our security experts who have appeared on the program and panelists identify debt and extreme poverty as two issues of national interest that may pose national security threat to the survival of African states. So since last year, September, so most of our panelists have been bringing this issue about debt and poverty as national security challenges which may face African countries. So as part of Sankofa discussion in the past 2 months, our focus has been on development strategy within the context of the African Union Agenda 2063 on African financing its own infrastructure projects, debt and poverty, given recent protests in Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria. We also have had 2 discussion series, each on Kenya, Ghana, and Nigeria. Last 2 weeks, we did 2 discussions on Nigeria, where we had panelists coming from PricewaterhouseCoopers joining us. So we cannot talk about developing debt and poverty without a World Bank at the table. So after a prolonged discussion with the World Bank Regional Director of Eastern and Southern Africa's office in Washington, D.C., we are fortunate to have our special guest for today and who I will introduce shortly. So to our listeners and viewers on the various social media platforms around the world, the Sankofa African webinars are anchored on a myriad of perspectives. So there may be differences of opinions from our guests based on their expertise, knowledge, and experiences. The difference in opinion does not necessarily mean perspectives and thoughts shared are wrong, but reflects a divergence of ideas to address security challenges facing the continent. And also, the Sankofa African webinar relies on narratives for its discussion programs. Narratives are an integral part of African societies, and in our discussion, we utilize them based on research findings, policy positions, and realities prevailing in various African countries. The narratives help our panelists to present their perspectives independently, and we sometimes may diverge from official government or organizational policy positions. So today, in addition to our guests, we are also joined by participants from CSO, media, and academia from across Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana. Our special guest today is Dr. Hassan Zaman, who wants me to refer to him as Hassan, right? Hassan Zaman. Actually, initially I thought he was Mr. I had to do my own research, and I realized that, okay, it seems like I'm doing something wrong. So what I did was that I posted your background, your profile, briefly on Facebook, on LinkedIn. So I wouldn't go into that because of time constraint. And also we have accompanied Dr. Zaman, or Mr. Zaman, we have Mr. Andrew Blackman. He's a World Bank senior economist for the Pacific region. He works with government across the Pacific on macroeconomic issues and development policy operations. Prior to joining the World Bank Pacific team, Andrew was an advisor to the coordinating minister for economic policy in Ecuador. He has also worked with the World Bank in Indonesia and the African region as a research fellow in Nigeria think tank and with the Australian Department of the Treasury. Andrew holds a master's in public administration and international development from the Harvard Kennedy School. So, Mr. Zaman and Mr. Blackman, we are honored to have you both, and welcome. We'll take this opportunity to welcome you to the Sankofa African webinar, where today we are using our program to educate and inform our listeners about the World Bank development strategy and economic policies towards addressing the debt and extreme poverty challenges facing the sub-Saharan African continent. So I take this opportunity to welcome both of you to our program.
Thank you so much, Professor Akwe, and it's really a pleasure to be here.
All right, thank you very much.
I want to really start by stressing how important it is for us to just have dialogue. As you said, to have dialogue on different topics which may be contentious, where we may have differences of opinion. But I'm really of the view that we need to just engage as much as possible and listen to those opinions, to different views, and us also share ours and just have conversations, just so that we can come up with solutions on challenges that we all care about. Now, as for the introduction, let me just say one thing. One is that Andrew has just joined my team a week ago from the East Asia region, so he's just joining because he's part of my front office. But I do want to introduce another colleague who has joined. She's Abha Prasad. She's the manager of the macroeconomics team in the department that I oversee. We have the macro team, we have the financial sector team, we have the governance team, we have the poverty team, and she is one of the managers of the macro team. She's based in Nairobi, and she's joining from there. And Abha Prasad may also help me in terms of in responding to some of the questions or in engaging in the conversation as well. But I won't put Andrew on the spot at this stage. He just moved a week ago from East Asia, as I said. But thank you again for inviting us, and look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. So, Dr. Nyaramba, you have one of our guests, Oscar, in Nairobi. So maybe after the program, the two of you can link up, right? So let's proceed. So we are going to take a brief opening remarks, right? Now, I want you to situate your opening remarks within the context of your experience and expertise working in Africa, given that in Africa, multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF are considered to have a negative reputation and likened to the village school head teacher who comes to the assembly hall with a cane or a whip in his hands to enforce discipline. This is the way Africans see the World Bank. It's like, okay, they are coming and they are coming with all kinds of conditions. So for the other African walking on the street, they have that kind of negative image about the World Bank. So I want you to put your opening remarks taking into consideration the way Africans perceive the World Bank or the IMF.
Well, that's indeed a very provocative opening statement, and if that may be the perception among some, Professor Akwe, and that indeed is unfortunate. My own view is that the work we do is basically, our objective is to provide financial resources, provide the knowledge that we have from across countries, to work with governments and other parts of society to help come up with development solutions and improve access to services, to improve the way governments run in terms of how they manage their resources, where we provide advice and financial support to support major reforms and economies. And the last part, of course, is what's associated with the conditionality part, right? But before I move on to that side of our business, which actually I oversee, just to be clear, and I will, and I'm happy to engage in a lot of that conversation. But just so that just so that I can explain a little bit, for example, how the Africa region is run, what I oversee. I oversee the eastern southern part of the region in terms of, as I mentioned, the economic policy part, which Abba is one of the managers who does that. We have a team on the ground across 22 countries, because, as I said, east southern, of colleagues who work with governments on that. Then we have the financial sector team, we have the poverty team, we have the governance team. But in addition, I mean, I'm one of 4 regional directors, and there are ones for infrastructure, there's one for human development, there's one for sustainable development, right? And whilst, since I'm here in a sense representing the bank overall, I really should highlight that a lot of the work that's done in those teams are about improving access. It's about improving access. I mean, just to give you one example, so for example, in infrastructure and electrification, one of our goals is to reduce the big gap in access to electricity, which is about 600 million people in Africa. And we have set a target to essentially electrify 300 million people by 2030, right? And, just to give, in terms of the progress that's been made, for instance, in Tanzania, just through one of our rural electrification programs, we have been able to provide 6 million people with access to electricity over the last few years. That's just one example. If you go, say, to the human development space in the social protection, there are about 8 million people who are covered by safety net programs in Ethiopia, right? And that was because for the last 15 years, we've been working with the Ethiopian government on setting up those systems in order to provide that. So just to give you an example that, in a sense, there is a large part of the work that we do is on trying to improve access to basic services. If I take the other day, when I was in Tanzania, went to visit our project on judicial sector reform, for example, right? And that, provides access to people in very remote parts of Tanzania to judicial services, because we finance these mobile courtrooms, right? And we provide which then a lot of people in remote areas, because they travel on a weekly basis to these remote areas, have access to these courts and have access to basically judicial services much faster than they would have, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that there's a large part of our business which is related to these things, which maybe doesn't get as much attention as what you said at the beginning, which is this perception that we're there with conditionality and that we're there to enforce this village headmaster analogy that you made out, right? And I feel in many ways, that's very much like a 1980s view of how the World Bank and IMF work. So let me speak mainly about the bank, since that's who I'm representing. But and perhaps back then we were the ones, who would just say, okay, if you don't meet this condition, these are the 10 conditions without which, if you don't meet all 10, you're not going to get our resources. And they were all decided in Washington, and that's the way it was. But our business model now, even in this space of supporting reforms, and again, that's the part of the business I do oversee, right? So I'm happy to engage with this, is really extremely different, right? So, for example, Abba sits in Nairobi. She has a team in the macro unit of about 7 people there, and she and the team work with the authorities in Kenya to try and think, okay, what are some of the main structural reforms that are needed to get Kenya's competitiveness up, but broadly to help reduce poverty in the country. And then what is part of part of the reform agenda? What are some of the reforms that the government feels they're committed to, that they own? Because ownership is critical for us to have any success. We've learned that over the years. There's no point imposing conditions when sitting in DC. And then can we put a program together which makes sense, right? Whereby the resources that we then provide support reforms that will enable the country to get to a growth path. That means that the money they're getting from us will have a return on it, right? And that's the way we work, in a very interactive way, with the government. We don't agree with all policies by any means, We always have very healthy debates with authorities in all the countries. But that's how we set up these program of reforms. Now, I acknowledge, look, we have watched these protests unfold. We understand that there's a lot of popular perceptions about how the fund and the bank behave, etc. And we would like to engage as much as possible to try and help people sort of have a broader view of how the bank works. And actually through engagements like this, which is one example of that, for example. But again, happy to elaborate on this side of the
Okay.
So that's kind of, let me stop there in terms of opening remarks.
Okay.
Suffice to say that we have a lot of challenges that fully and that we need to tackle together, especially on the poverty front, which is a needle that hasn't moved much in East and Southern Africa, unfortunately, except for certain select countries. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. Right. So we'll delve into the issues later on. But let me come to you, Dr. Nyaramba. Do you agree with my assessment that the ordinary African walking on the street, whenever he hears the word World Bank and the IMF, the perception is that is the big brother coming in to enforce conditions? Dr. Nyaramba, do you agree with that? Zaman is saying that was the perception in the 80s and the 90s. But do you think that currently, right, on the continent, that is still the prevailing perception of the IMF and the World Bank?
Prof, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Prof?
Yeah.
Sorry, it seems...
I can hear you. Go ahead. All right. If Dr. Nyaramba, we can't hear from Dr. Nyaramba, let's continue, right? So
I do want to clarify something,
okay,
Professor Akwe. I didn't mean to say that perception doesn't exist now.
Okay.
Right. What I'm trying to say is that perception of how we work has its roots in the structural adjustment conditionality of the 1980s.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Okay.
But the point that I'm trying to make is that we work in a very different way now, and maybe we haven't been able to communicate that sufficiently so that perception on the street changes. I mean, I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
Sure. Thank you.
And that's why dialogue like this helps. That's what I'm trying to say.
Thank you very much for the clarification. All right. Okay. So since we can hear from Dr. Nyaramba, let's proceed with the narrative. So I sent 3 different narratives, right? So I don't want to repeat the narratives over here. You already know the narrative. So I'm going to now post my question on narrative on development strategy to support low middle income African countries. Right. So this is the question on that particular narrative. Right. Given your expertise, knowledge, and experience in East Africa, East Asia, what are the challenges confronting African countries in experiencing a miracle like the East Asia miracle? And how is the World Bank supporting some of the lower middle income countries in Africa through their development strategies in adding to investment-driven strategy measures to infuse modern technologies and successful business processes from around the world into their national economies?
Thank you very much, Professor Akwe, for that. And just as a background, actually, for about 4 years, I was the regional director for East Asia and the Pacific, covering the same set of issues that I'm now for East Africa. In East Africa, I took up this role just a year ago. So I'm happy you asked this question because I feel it's close to my heart.
Okay.
So I think there are certain fundamentals that worked in East Asian countries that I think are extremely relevant for our countries in Africa, and I'd like to state them. One is the whole emphasis on macro stability. Yeah, if you look at the success stories, whether it's Korea, Vietnam, to Malaysia, Indonesia, they really do stress just focus on low inflation, focus on fiscal discipline, a focus on careful management of their debt, And that is a precondition and a fundamental precondition that several countries in our continent right now do not have, and we can get onto that to that topic. But let me just list a few things. That's number one. The second is a focus on outward orientation, right? Just so so a focus on exports. Now, in Korea, of course, as you know, there were specific state institutions. It was very much state-led at the beginning, state-led institutions that I went and visited and spent many days having conversations with to try and understand how they worked, what their fiscal implications were, etc., which helped open up Korea's, the Samsungs of the world, etc., to foreign markets. And then the state gradually withdrew, but they never gave preferential incentives to specific countries. They made sure it was incentives for the public sector, and specifically actually targets within the public sector for public sector officials to be able to reach, so that overall there were exports, not favoring, you know, friendly company A and friendly company B who are close to the government, right? That's again, that whole competition environment. And whilst it's true that in countries like Korea, there are specific conglomerates which have developed over time, but it's not like, you know, it's because there was a level playing field, though they emerged, and then now they've taken over in terms of the share of R&D expenditure in as a share of GDP. If you look at Korea right now, I mean, 3/4 of it is private sector R&D, actually, whereas before, when you think about 25 years ago, there's a lot of it was public sector R&D expenditures, right, which helped. Anyway, but that helped that export orientation part of things. And then, you know, what I would say is that thirdly, there was also domestic market liberalization, which allowed foreign investment to also come in, right? So one is export orientation for local firms, etc., and but also there's a lot of foreign direct investment, which, for example, in Vietnam, when I've spent a lot of time there, the Korean investment in Vietnam is also very, very important in order when you look at the exports, the export-led boom that Vietnam is. And then I would stress also other domestic market reforms, such as on agricultural pricing reform, on opening up agricultural markets. So again, if I use Vietnam as an example, the reforms in the late 90s and early 2000s are opening up those markets, allowing from moving from a collective sort of form of system to allowing the private sector to essentially have incentives to grow and produce were also fundamental. So there are a lot of these things that right now we are working with our counterparts in order to try and support. And in different countries, there's different priorities. In some countries, it is on the macro, the fundamentals have to be there. In other countries, it's the market contestability part, right? In others, it's like improving the ways the governments work so that there's, you know, it's not like you're favoring certain people and there's less corruption, etc. And I'm not trying to say that there isn't corruption in East Asia and Pacific at all, right? But I'm just saying that in terms of, you know, the emphasis that we put in different countries to be able to have a growth model that supports basically an outward orientation, exports, more markets that work, and more domestic competition, so that it's not just a few oligopolies which are running everything. Yeah, those are the parallels I see, Professor Akwe.
All right, thank you for that submission. Let me see whether Dr. Nyaramba can hear me. Dr. Nyaramba, can you hear me?
Yes, Prof. Can you hear me?
Listening to Dr. Hassan, right? What is your take on some of the things that he listed, or some of the things that he put forward in terms of some of the challenges confronting the African continent compared to what happened in the East Asia?
Prof, thank you, and thank you, Dr. for the highlight that you've given. And to answer you directly, Prof, from our side, there is that focus on the question of debt trap, that Africa is already caught up in debt trap, and that the main agenda confronting the government in Africa is not even to deal with the issue of poverty, but to pay the debt that they already owe. And of course, comparing with the focus with Asia, which was more on export promotion, Africa could have been some challenges that most of the goods that are exported are mainly raw materials or at primary level. So as a bit different from that of Asia, I would actually say that in Africa, we have a challenge whereby the export is primarily on raw materials, on primary goods, and let me call them the development partners are not helping, especially when it comes to value addition or on this aspect. So for me, I think there is the concept of the capacity to export or to add value and export, and more so given that a lot of countries in Africa already found themselves in the situation of debt trap. Thank you.
Right. You want to say something? I want to follow up, right? In terms of technologies, right? You see that most countries in the East were able to transition into technologies. The problem we have in Africa, right? Even though Africa talks about technology, they've not been able to take advantage of the first, second industrial revolution, second industrial revolution, third industrial revolution. We saw in the 80s and the 90s where they were trying to do import substitution industries, and that created a lot of problems for them. So the problem is that African countries have not focused on, have not done the dirty work, the hard work to be able to catch up with technology, to be able to add value to their raw materials. Would you agree with that assertion, that submission that I'm just making?
So, Professor Akwe, on the technology front, I mean, I think, okay, so I mean, the way I would put it is that I think there are many countries who are still focused on the primary production and the extractive industries in a way, and the potential to be able to use it's not just technology, but also to set up an investment climate that allows for greater processing within Africa and greater value addition within Africa. For example, whether it's in Zambia or in DRC, you know, on the green mineral space, that's, I completely agree that there's that, but I wouldn't, to be fair, say it's only a technology issue, right? I mean, because let's say that in East Asia there was no macro stability, that there was no climate for foreign investors to come in, and that all the government resources were going to their preferred friends. And then if we just inserted technology into that equation, East Asia wouldn't have been where it is now, right? So, I mean, technology is part of the solution. It's an important part of the solution, I'd like to stress. And then let's also think about what other types of technology, because if you think about the IT revolution now, right, there are, to be fair, many companies in your country, Ghana, or whether it's in Kenya or Ethiopia, a lot of places where young entrepreneurs are taking advantage of the ICT revolution to be able to export services from Africa. And, you know, there are countless examples of that, which I'm sure you know more than me, right? So it's not like they haven't, but is there a support? Well, the way I like to think about it, the way I like to think about, say, the way in East Asia they're trying to do it, is there a supported ecosystem, right, to move from technology adoption, right, first, the adoption part, and then move to the innovation stage and move along what's called the innovation frontier, of which we've done some work on this in the space. And what we do in certain countries like Namibia and South Africa and others, for example, is we map out for certain sectors what are some of the gaps in the innovation ecosystem, in order to be able to help governments think about, all right, so for example, do you need to set up, like within the Ministry of Science and Technology, for example, some sort of an innovation hub, or is it better to have it cross-cutting? These are some of the issues that we do discuss. But I guess my bottom line that I'm trying to say is that yes, technology is important, but cannot be the sole solution for many of the issues that we're dealing with. So yeah, that's my point. Yeah, thanks.
Let me follow up with the issue of what you raised, the issue of FDI, foreign direct investment, right? Now, if you look on the African continent, there's a huge infrastructure gap, right? Which needs to be closed before, because you're talking about attracting foreign direct investment, then you have to have your power grid system right. You have to have your road network right. You have to have your airport system right. These are things which are lacking on the African continent. So given these challenges, how do they attract this FDI? Because these companies will only come in when you have all these things well structured up. They don't want to come and be having challenges. Ghana, for example, is dealing with, almost 8 years ago, was dealing with electrical issues. They are still dealing with road issues. We go across the whole African continent, and we have serious infrastructural gap. Right? And even though Africans are talking about the debt, right? The infrastructure that we have, it means what? We should rather be borrowing more money to be able to construct most of these infrastructure, to be able to attract the FDI. So it seems like we are in a catch-22 situation. We are worried about the debt, at the same time we want to attract foreign direct investment.
So the way I would put it, Professor Akwai, is that I completely agree with you that access to core infrastructure is a key bottleneck. And that's why I mentioned right in my opening remarks about the electrification target that we have at the World Bank to support, right? And that's why, you know, in some of these countries, which are all grants, which only receive all grants, for example, or very concessional, what I call IDA terms from the World Bank, we are putting a lot of resources into, say, electrification or into digital infrastructure. We have a target in terms of broadband access to in terms of to significantly increase that as well, and also in roads. I mean, I was in DRC a couple of weeks ago, and you know, yes, I would say that access to basic transport networks from one part of the country to another is absolutely essential, right, in order to attract investment. But then what we absolutely need is that it cannot be publicly financed infrastructure entirely to be able to meet the needs, right? For sure, you need to be able to mobilize private capital to come in, you know, to be able to have, you know, PPP arrangements or various arrangements that can help you set up things that make sense. Of course, those contracts need to be scrutinized so that, you know, African countries are getting a fair deal, you know, and that the tolls that are imposed are not an excessive burden on poor people, right? You know, but the point I'm trying to make is that the investment in infrastructure can be reconciled with more prudent management of debt, by focusing the public resources, and public I mean borrowing as well from official sources, from low cost sources, but also attracting in the private sector to be able to bring in private capital to do that. And you know, so yeah, we will focus on this area quite a bit in the years ahead. I mean, I mentioned our target is to, for example, help double broadband connectivity from 34% currently to 68% by 2030, for example, on broadband. And I mentioned the electricity target. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. Dr. Nyiramba, let me come back to you, right? So Zaman is talking about PPP, right? And in terms of infrastructure. Now, you saw what Kenya did, what Ethiopia did in terms of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. That's a huge project, which at this point is 95% completed. It's worth over $4 billion, right? These are the sort of projects that Africa needs in order to be able to attract the FDI. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, yes. The PPP projects actually in some countries in Africa have really come to rescue, especially where such major investments are called for. Now, the only undoing, especially this from the side of the accountability, is the aspect of costing. You'll find that some of these PPP projects, to start with, of course, are mainly done in partnership with individuals, of course, from or investors based in other countries, and some of the outcome is that they end up resorting to heavy debts, where at times it's possible to avoid, especially where the raw materials that goes into the investment have to be imported, whereas it could have been avoided. So the arrangement mainly is burdened with a lot of corruptions. They end up burdening the country, especially once it comes to completely and heavily relying on imports, both on raw materials and also on labor, which to some extent could be unavoided. So I agree that the resort to investment, which in other words could have not been realized without PPP, but then it leaves the countries that have done that with quite a heavy load of debt at the end of it.
So your worry is it about the debt, or is it the money borrowed which end up in people's private pockets? But it's not that the debt itself is too huge.
Prof, both do happen. You find that the arrangements, individuals involved end up, like, for example, I would wish to talk about the PPP in Kenya, which eventually has resulted into expressway. You find that along the way, the information coming is that the PPP is more based, or is actually connected to individuals already in powers, and therefore the cost went from what initially was expected to double. And this actually is money that eventually will have to be paid by local. These are resources that will have to be paid by local. So to start with, there is the aspect of accountability when it comes to PPP arrangements. A lot of information end up not being provided to the public. A lot of issues, the agreements are not out there to the public for scrutiny and accountability. And now number two is that it becomes an arrangement that leaves the country heavily burdened in debts.
Okay, so go ahead.
In both cases, you'll hear that there is heavy corruption involved in the PPP arrangement, and number two, of course, the burden that the country eventually is left in.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you. So that means the World Bank mostly offered some of these loans, or what they call project targeted loans, right? These money are given out for projects, so this can be easily tracked, evaluated, compared to the government going to borrow and money end up in people's private pockets. So I think that is what the World Bank has been doing, mostly giving money for specific infrastructure projects. Correct, Dr. Hassan?
The answer is yes. At the same time, in several of our projects, we do recognize that, as I said, that the scale of the challenge is so large, financing needs are so large that it cannot be done without the private sector coming in, right? So our objective in many of these infrastructure projects is to, in a sense, de-risk them by providing and when I say ours, it's not just World Bank, but it's also the World Bank Group, right? We have the IFC, we have what's called MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Association, which covers for certain types of risks. But the whole idea is to bring in others as well, in a way that makes sense for the country. But I would like to come back to what was said by our colleague from Kenya, and I fully agree with his points in the sense that there needs to be greater accountability and transparency of these PPP deals. There needs to be publication so that the public can see what the terms are, who are getting these contracts, and what is the return to the public investment on these things, and even after borrowing, during the construction period, after the construction period, there should be some ex post monitoring to see, well, was this worth it? And so I just want to answer your question, but also respond to what he said in this. And so we do push quite a bit for transparency, and actually, perhaps I might invite my colleague Abha Prasad, who has worked quite a bit on debt transparency issues, if she would like to come in on this point as well.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Prasad. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Kain, and thank you, Dr. Hassan. So just wanted to say that from the World Bank side, we actually have a heat map on debt transparency, which is made public, wherein we monitor almost all our borrower countries in terms of debt reporting, in terms of their total debt data, which is put on their websites, in terms of transparency of contingent liabilities, PPP contracts, large values. Also, the periodicity of this is also monitored. That it's not that you just report it once in 4 years and that's the end of it. It's how frequently you do it. There is a traffic light system adopted, and it's in the public domain. And it's actually a very useful public good, which other creditors from the OECD, etc., also monitor on that. So the World Bank takes a lot of effort on that. I also wanted to add something which Dr. Hassan had mentioned about prudent debt management, and which Professor Njarama has been talking about, the issue of governance. So debt per se, Professor Akwi, I would say, is not bad. It is how you utilize the debt and what sort of borrowing contracts you make. I think that is the key point here, because if you look at and why does, if you look at the debt dynamics per se in most of our African countries, the challenge is because the growth rate has not been commensurate to help us with the interplay between the rate of interest that you pay and the financing of the fiscal deficit. And that is what has caused this burden to keep growing, wherein Professor Njarama has rightly said that for some countries, you're actually borrowing in order to pay off the interest rates that you have taken. But it's not just enough to make that generalization. It's important to look at the debt from the external side, which you're talking about World Bank, IMF, and what is domestic debt. In certain countries like Malawi, even if all the debt on the external side is written down or brought down, it's still domestic debt, which is extremely high. And then the rate of interest on that debt is also very high because inflation rate is high, and it's also monetary financing. So you're perpetuating a cycle which you cannot stop, even if you clear up from the external side. And to add to what Hassan had mentioned, from the external side, especially from the World Bank, a large number of these countries get grants, which means you don't pay us back. And if that grant money is not then utilized for appropriate capital investment, and used up for revenue funding or current expenditures, obviously that has gone. Which would have helped to reduce the burden of debt has not been, is there. So just wanted to highlight a few of those. Happy to add anything else needed.
All right, thank you very much. So I want us to go to our next narrative, which has to do with the debt situation that we just enumerated. So I sent an article which was written by Patricia Cohen to you, right? So I'll just go to the question right away so that we could discuss that. So my question to you is that given the dire outlook of the implications of debt on the continent and the recent economic and hardships, corruption and bad governance protests in countries like Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda, what is the World Bank's economic policy towards sub-Saharan Africa to help governments of these countries navigate these challenges to avoid a destabilizing debt default and its catastrophic implications for the entire world?
Thanks very much, Professor Akwe, and I'll start and maybe I'll hand over to Abba as well for some more details. But I mean, I fully agree with that article in the sense that this is a growing problem, and we are worried about this problem. We are a lot more worried now than we were, say, pre-COVID. Because that shock really did dent a lot of growth prospects and set in play and then following geopolitical events, prices went up. So the thing is that what is it that we're doing? We're doing multiple things. First of all, one needs to think about some of the root causes of why debt went up a lot over the past 10 years, right? So when the median public debt to GDP went up from 30% in 2012, 57% in 2021, and to then 61% in 2023. And they were already accompanied by a shift towards non-traditional and commercial borrowing, including Eurobonds, and quite an increase in bilateral borrowing as well. And the cost of that borrowing, the average cost of that borrowing was much higher than the pre-2012 period. Let's put it this way. Yeah, so that's kind of one big factor, right? At that time, interest rates were low, access to capital markets were easy, and so there was a bit of a splurge on that front, right? Okay. And then the point is some of the investments that were made using that borrowing essentially didn't generate the growth, as Abba just mentioned, to essentially be able to repay those in a way that didn't affect education and health spending, which is now being cramped because of this, right? So that's kind of a big source of what's happened. So then what are we doing? For a start, we want to make sure that for the countries which are in high risk of debt distress, that we are also not further compounding the problem by lending to them, right? So we have switched. So compared to pre-COVID, the bank is now giving more grants to 12 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, including 100% grants to 7 countries: Ghana, Zambia, Kenya, Malawi, Ghana, Zambia, Malawi, Comoros, Guinea-Bissau, and Sierra Leone. And so, so that's one thing, and Abba mentioned that as well. So there are net flows that we provide are on grant terms on many of them. And then we've been working with many of these countries to think about, okay, what are the reforms necessary to get growth back up, so that one can generate the returns, and that varies, right, in a lot of these countries. But for example, recently in Ethiopia, we worked with the government to think about a program of reforms, which it was designed to essentially move the economy to one where there will be greater private investment and greater jobs created, because jobs need to be at the center of this in order to be able to basically generate the growth and poverty reduction we need to be able to repay these debts. So those reforms, and we can go, if you want to talk about the recent Ethiopian reforms, which included a major exchange rate adjustment and then shifts to more market-based solutions in the financial sector, in the export of key grain commodities, in a big expansion of safety nets, etc. We can do that, but I just want to give that as an example. But then also other growth-enhancing investments, from providing access to startup financing in various countries, you know, and then the investments that we discussed earlier in infrastructure, etc. Right. So that's one domain. The second is on the management of the debt itself, right? And there we have really stepped up our technical assistance in terms of thinking about, all right, so you know, one, in terms of debt transparency, we have now put in a lot more requirements for in order to be able to get our money, whether it's grants or loans, we need to make sure there's greater debt transparency. So over the last few years, you can check on the websites, we'll have a lot more information on how much countries are borrowing. Maybe not as much as we would like, but a lot more than before on the debt transparency angle, right? So we've really focused on that. And then strengthening debt management offices as well, and building capacity there. We put in quite a bit of emphasis. And then we've also been a key player in debt restructurings, right? Now, in some in certain cases, they've taken longer than others. And I think, for example, in Zambia, it's taken a while, but there's been quite a bit of progress in trying to get to a debt deal, right? But based on that, what I noticed, for example, having participated in Ethiopia's recent conversations on a debt restructuring deal, that whole lessons from Zambia and the ability to try and speed up certain processes have actually enabled the Ethiopians to get financing assurances on a debt restructuring much faster than other countries did as part of what's called the common framework process, right? So I don't want to belabor this, but these are some of the key things I would say in terms of what is it that we're thinking. First, we recognize a super important problem. Two, we would try and identify what the sources of those are and try and help advise governments to try and move away from that expensive non-concessional borrowing to ones that make more sense and are more transparent. And three, focus a lot on the sources of growth. And of course, and I should have mentioned, a lot more focus on domestic revenue mobilization as well, in order to be able to substitute away from this debt. Abba, is there anything you want to add from your perspective?
Yes, thank you, Hassan. So I think you very comprehensively covered it. Just two more points I wanted to add, Professor. One is that the bank has, in addition to debt management, as Hassan mentioned, we are also working a lot with our countries on innovative debt schemes, you know, in terms of supporting them through green finance, climate swaps, ways to reduce debt, but using much more innovative techniques to do that. And the other thing which the bank has put in place very, very comprehensively today, and which is very important for our African clients, is our crisis response framework. Because we do realize that as it is, the buffers are not too much on the fiscal side. And what little is there gets eroded very fast with one crisis after the other. It's either flooding or it's drought or it's, you know, one thing or the other, or it's a pandemic. And so we are supporting them in terms of not only putting options on our lending instruments so that they can get quick finance quickly, but also supporting them with things like what we call the catastrophe deferred drawdown options, like CAT DDOs. We had this for Malawi. And when Malawi had the drought along with Zambia, in literally in a matter of 20 odd days or 28 days, Malawi was able to access over 55 million from the bank very quickly from that, because that was kind of insurance which they had bought, that if something would go wrong, they would get this additional money. And also we are supporting them by transferring risk to the market through issuance of CAD bonds. That's not yet been done in Africa, but it's something which has been explored and also implemented in the Caribbean, for instance, in Jamaica. And so that's something which we are trying in terms of crisis response. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Dr. Nyirema, do you have a question for Dr. Hassan in terms of what is happening in Kenya, right? Do you have a question for him?
Sure, I do, Prof. And I thank you so much, Hassan. I think the presentation, in fact, also from Amber and also what the World Bank is doing, specifically for Kenya. I just wanted to focus, and especially on the current situation and the government in place. I'm sure here we talk without fear. That if I'm to focus at what is happening in Kenya, and I will start from the fact that the number of deaths, of course, Prof. Hassan has actually put it, that we went wrong once we started borrowing commercially at a very high interest rate. And of course, a number of debt then had to be incurred to service that. Now, I wanted to understand from the World Bank perspective that whether they are not concerned about these leaders whom the debt even acquired. Like, for example, I want to give that one of Eurobond 1 in Kenya that was acquired in the year 2014. That money never even hit the consolidated bank or the consolidated account in Kenya as per the requirement of the law. However, the World Bank continue transacting with the government even when it is doing the financial illicit in the country. Is it not concerned that the mismanagement or illegal debts, as I may call them, have put the country into the position they are, and therefore put the government into account before it accord further debts to it, or even before it comes to rescue, as even that has happened at some point. Even the country or the citizens in the country have been crying and even calling World Bank and IMF to stop further lending to the government. Has it never been of concern to you? That is the first question I have. Number two is the aspect of the exchange rate adjustment. Prof. Hassan has actually put it well that they're assisting countries in Africa, that they would come into a position that the exchange rate is able to adjust, and more so to one that can work for the country. And allow me to say, as a scholar, this is an area that I feel that Africa has actually been a major culprit. That the moment the exchange rate, and based more on the fact that it's using borrowed foreign currency, has suppressed the actual, what we may call the actual exchange rate. It has always been, or it is always the case, that the domestic currencies in Africa are highly overvalued. And by so doing, the countries are subsidizing foreign goods, of course, at the cost of the domestic goods. And if you look even at the conditions required, mainly, requirements that are given given interest rate has to be maintained, given inflation rate has to be maintained. This has absconded, or it has actually made Africa countries to have what we may call a complete potent kind of monetary policy, a monetary policy that does not work for domestic good, like, for example, is stimulating production, increasing employment. Rather, it has just been used to support foreign production by encouraging further and more of imports rather than protecting domestic production. So those questions, Prof, I would want to put forward to Hassan, and more so to I want to call her my country member, that is Madam Amber. Does it really not matter to you that these are the reasons why Africa countries are in the situation they find themselves to? Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. So any of you could pick it up, any of the questions that
Sure. So, I mean, let me start on the exchange rate issue, because I completely agree when he says, does it not matter to us? Well, actually, the exchange rate issue matters hugely to us. In fact, in countries, just to be clear what the World Bank policies are, when in countries where we see significantly misaligned exchange rates, we're not allowed to do, even in our operational policy, what's called budget support loans, the ones which are the ones that we talked about at the beginning, which have, we can do project loans, but we can't do what's called budget support. And in fact, in certain countries, for example, and that's why I referred to Ethiopia just in my previous intervention, right? Because there was this pretty much 100% gap between the official and parallel rates, which we thought was a major distortion on the economy for all the reasons and that the professor mentioned, that we were not doing budget support. It's only when they did the adjustment of the currency that we felt that there was value for our money, and we went and provided the budget support that we did. And similarly, there are certain other countries in the region where the gap between the official rate and the parallel rate, parallel rate really is what the market rate is what the real rate should be, right? We all know that, or very close to it. There might be like a 5% or 10% gap because of transaction costs or whatever, right? But it cannot be 100% gap. And there are certain countries where those so significant, and we're working with the governments along with the IMF, because the exchange rate, the IMF also takes a bit of a conceptual lead, but we support them on that, to try and figure out why can't they just try and bridge that gap, and then we'll be able to provide more resources. So just to say that we care about misaligned exchange rates just as much as, and I just wanted to give some examples of the fact that it's not just we care conceptually, but our money follows that principle as well, right? Okay. Then on the first part about transparency, about Eurobond proceeds, etc. Now, one thing that we did during this past year is we worked with the government to help basically establish and set up, not just in Kenya, but actually we're doing this in other countries as well, the Treasury single account system, so that, it will help have a more unified and transparent way of monitoring inflows and outflows as well. That was a key, what we call the prior action that we discussed jointly with the government for us to be able to move ahead with our previous budget support operation. And so that's that. So we care a lot, and this is in addition to other measures that we worked with them to try and ensure greater accountability of public funds, such as trying to move to an e-procurement system as well, which is now going to be mandated to all major spending units in Kenya as well, right? So again, one can try and track it. Not that e-procurement is a magic bullet to resolve corruption, we know that, but it's a step in the right direction. Yeah. So I think that's what I would, that's the way I would respond to that.
All right,
Thank
you. Professor, do you have something to add to what Hassan just said? Do you have anything to add to that?
Thank you so much. So I think Hassan covered it very, very well, but just wanted to add that especially in the case of Kenya or any country where we do any kind of lending operations, we very critically examine the PFM disbursement and auditing systems in that country. And as part of that, what Hassan mentioned is on the public procurement side, we also check if the country has an IFMIS at all levels, are the staff well trained, there's a complete assessment. And this also follows through with an IMF safeguards assessment, which is done. And finally, when we lend to a country, the loan and credit disbursements will have to follow the complete World Bank's procedures and accounting. From an accounting perspective, all the accounts which are put through, within 30 days, that money should be withdrawn from the financing account. They should report to the World Bank what is taken. So there's a whole process which is followed through. And in addition to that, for other kind of borrowings that they do, we support them with this treasury single accounts to make sure that there is a sweep of all the cash which enters the government's account in different banks or in different SOEs. They all sweep and come into one consolidated fund account. And that's something which has really been pushed forward. And even the Kenyan government was very much, how should I say, invested in that. So that was something which came through, which helps with not only procurement, cash management, but also debt management, because then it reduces the cost of carry. Sometimes you have money lying in one account, not realizing, and you'd still borrow because you've got to pay debt service elsewhere. And plus, we also look at the government of Kenya in terms of how it publishes its budget, the internal audit, as well as the external auditing by the Supreme Audit Institution. So all that is assessed, and we come through with an assessment of the risks before any kind of lending is done. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Before we go to our last narrative, I want to follow up with a question that has to do with Nigeria and Ghana. In the case of Nigeria, the World Bank recommended that subsidies on petroleum products be removed, which the government did, right? But we know that the overall impact, right? That is, it had economic effect on the people, and the people took to the streets, right? It was a good thing because a lot of money was saved to pay off the debt. So that is one issue. Let's come to Ghana. We saw the impact of the debt restructuring in Ghana, DDEP, which moved almost like 850,000 people into poverty. Like I said, we will discuss that later on. So how do you address these two different situations in Ghana where it did work without any protest, but in Nigeria where the subsidies was removed, but the people took to the street because of the economic impact on their lives?
Professor Akwe, I just wanted to clarify that I cover Eastern Southern Africa, and so I don't know enough about the issues in Ghana and Nigeria. I can recommend my colleague who covers that region, who might be able to answer that particular question.
Yeah. Well, but time is fast spent. So let's go to the last narrative, right? And if you have to come back. So the last narrative has to deal with extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of those countries which they consider them to be what? Fragile conflict areas, right? So I sent the narrative to you. Now, this is the question that I want to ask. Now, how is the bank working with its strategic and international partners, and especially the African Union, on its master roadmap of practical steps to silence the guns to reduce extreme poverty in fragile and conflict states? I don't know whether you are aware of the African Union master roadmap of silencing the gun, measures to reduce conflict on the African continent. They actually passed it 2016. It was supposed to expire in 2020, but because of COVID, it has been expanded to 2030. So they are taking steps in terms of setting what you call measure that should be taken, early warning signs that should be taken to avoid conflict in most African countries. And we are seeing some challenges in most of African democracy. We see what is happening in in Western Africa, right? In terms of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, we have conflict over there. Then you go to the south, we have South Sudan is already in conflict. We have Sudan also in conflict. We can come to the DR Congo also in conflict. So how is the bank even though we know the World Bank does not actually engage politically, but how is the World Bank working with its international partners and the African Union to avoid such conflicts so as to minimize the extreme conflict, extreme poverty in some of these conflict areas?
Thanks very much, Professor Kwe. I should say that it's true, we are not a political organization, and so we don't sort of actively engage in sort of conflict mediation at the political levels, etc., like maybe other partners like the African Union do, etc. But at the same time, we have what's called a fragile and conflict, an FCB and violence strategy, because, a lot of this obviously affects the work that we do. And so we have to think about how do we engage in countries that have persistent conflict or have sudden emergence of conflict, etc. And obviously that varies, but some of the principles lies in trying to understand. We try and work with partners to do an assessment of what are the drivers of these conflicts, right? And a number of times these are socioeconomic, right? They're also about conflicts over natural resources, etc. And so for some of the areas so one is, let me, before I get, so one of them is an assessment of trying to think of the drivers. The other is trying to think about, the preventative measures, and then post-conflict, in the states that emerge, what are some of the state building, the measures that we can take? And let me just try and draw on a couple of examples. So for example, when we identify that, for example, if you look at South Sudan, our engagement there, it's very much on how do we try and use oil resources in a way that's transparent and is used for the betterment of the whole population. And so a lot of work on the oil fund, on transparency, and etc. Right. So just wanted to give an example of, and so if I think about Mozambique, if I think of a lot of work on the fiscal part of natural resource management, right? Then we think about it broadly, drivers of conflict. It could be across ethnic groups, it could be, etc. Not just over access to resources, but just access to economic opportunities. And so we advocate quite a bit with our for whatever little influence that we have, to try and provide access to services in an equitable way. Now, that obviously it's a political decision that governments have to take, but we try and emphasize that as well, just because we know that the differential access to services creates mistrust in government, and then that also fuels conflict as well, right? And that's also in countries which are about to enter conflict, right? And as well as those in. But then, we also think about, okay, so post-conflict, if I think about Somalia, etc., that's an example of a country where we have tried to invest in basic state building, and then trying to think about the intergovernmental transfers between the center and some of its main sort of provinces, the federal, whatever, there are about 5 of them, and just the distribution of resources from the center to them, so that when we provide resources to the center, we have conversations about the distribution as well across the FMSs as well. And so because we want to be part of a process that doesn't then fuel further conflict by just, say, favoring the center versus other parts of the country as well, right? And we also emphasize basic state building. So we would want to say, okay, how do you build basic fiduciary capacity, procurement capacity, building the state from the ground up without making very complicated or sophisticated reforms, just building things up stepwise as well. So, I would say these are, we may not be a political organization, but we take this into account very carefully, just because, unfortunately, many of our countries are in this. situation, and we have to also factor in where there are active conflict zones as well, to think about, what then makes most sense in terms of development of the overall country, whilst taking into account the fact that there are also active conflict zones in certain parts as well. And DRC is an example of that, where we have to sort of pay a lot of attention to that as well. So,
right, thank you very much. Right. Dr. Nyereba, do you have a question on that? In terms of working with international partners and the African World Union on silencing a gun, to be able to see the early warning signs of some of these countries that will be moving towards conflict. The US has what we call Global Fragility Act, right, which identifies certain countries on the continent that needs to be worked on, right? So do you have any question with respect to that?
Yes, Prof, and thank you, Hassan, for that highlight. The conflicts are found in Africa, and you'll find that wherever they are found, they are the issue of resource conflict, and that even when there are those disagreements, the exploitation of resources continues to happen. Talk of DRC, talk of Somalia. Those resources continues to be exploited, to be exported, and we have come, of course, without maybe concrete evidence to a point we would want to say this conflict mainly are instigated from outside. They are supported, and there is no way they will end until our development partners put complete sanctions, especially when it comes to exploitation of these resources, so that unless the conflicts are done away with, then there is no trading, there is no exploitation of these resources. Why does that not probably comes from our development partners, so that we block further exploitation up and until when these conflicts are completely done with, so that we start with the protection of life to start with, dealing with these people that are benefiting from the conflict by trading with the resources being exploited, and of course then destabilizing the area and the continent at large.
All right, thank you very much. Now, let me come back to Dr. Hassan, right? I'm in the US, right? I have a company in Ghana, and I have another company over here. So we have a platform where we are able to engage experts from US organizations, agencies, and other people from the African continent. But people in Africa, right, do not have access to some of these people. I don't know how many people in Africa will be able to have access to you. How do we make it very easy for journalists and experts on the African continent to be able to engage in this kind of dialogue, right? To make the population understand what is really going on. Like, let me give you a very good example. We've been hosting some of these programs since last year. We've done programs on Kenya and South Africa, Sudan, DR Congo, Chad, Niger, Rwanda, almost all around the place, as a way of educating and informing the people on the continent, right? Next month, we are trying to have what we call a national dialogue in Ghana on the death situation in Ghana, right, at UPSA, which we are still looking for funding. So just trying to bring this to your attention. How do experts and journalists, the media houses, get access to people like you to be able to engage and bring these issues to the fore?
I mean, thanks very much for this. And I just want to say that we want to engage. I just want to be very clear. If you want to engage on a country-specific issue, like say Ghana, we have our country directors in pretty much all of these countries, right? They are available. They would be happy to engage. We have in each of these countries a media relations person who one should approach, and then they will if you want to talk about, for example, infrastructure in Ghana, it may be the infrastructure specialist, for example, right, who might be brought to the table. So whatever the topic is, not whatever, but in a lot of the topics, we have experts who can engage. If you want more of a regional perspective, yes, people like myself, are available to you. For West and Central Africa, I would recommend, my counterpart who covers Ghana and Nigeria. And if you want, I'll give you his name separately. So I mean, so I guess if you look at the World Bank website, we have our media contacts. The names are there. You write to them. You say, want to engage on this topic. We are at your disposal to have these conversations, and not just you, but others who want to have like a conversation like this. No problem. I mean, yeah, that's really what I want to say.
All right. Thank you very much. Time is fast spent, right, brother? Do you have any closing thoughts? Okay, let's go to Dr. Nyaramba. Do you have any closing thoughts so far on what we've been able to discuss today?
Sorry, I didn't realize you were asking me. I thought you were asking.
No, I was talking to Prasad. I'll let you have the last closing word. Right?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, very happy that I got a chance to participate. And just to echo what Hassan is saying, that we have very active participation with the media in Kenya. And we come out with our economic updates twice a year, which is the flagship publication. And we have a meeting with all the media, the key media representatives. We issue out an invite to them through our communications advisor and our communications team here. And we meet with them prior to coming out, even with the launch on the next day. And the same thing applies for other countries where where Hassan, as he mentioned, in Africa East, be it Malawi, be it Zambia, Tanzania, Angola, etc. We have very active contact. So just please feel free to reach out and our offices will connect you.
Sure. Thank you very much. Dr. Nyaramba, do you have any closing remarks before we go finally to Dr. Hassan?
Yes, and I'm truly thankful for this opportunity also to have interacted with Professor Hassan, Madam Amba, and I wish to request that in the interaction, especially when it comes to understanding the dynamics, what's ailing, like for example, the Africa countries. There are specific issues, and I wish to say that it's good to broaden the consultation, the engagement, so that it also captures, especially those that are mainly researcher. There are quite a number of issues already being identified as the source of the problems, and you will find that in most of the time they do disagree with the solutions or the diagnostics being put forward, especially by our development partner. And Professor Hassan, I really want to beseech the World Bank and the IMF these efforts to raise revenue from poor, I think need to be reconsidered. The countries already being faced by individuals who are mainly and minority in the formal setup, and they are being really squeezed by that demand to increase the public revenue. Instead, I would seek a situation where the fiscal budget is reduced to the minimum, rather than raising revenue from the public sector approach. Thank you, and thank you for that opportunity and the interaction.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan. You have the final word before we say goodbye.
Sure. I mean, just a quick word on the last comment is that I completely agree. I think taxation needs to be progressive. In other words, the rich should pay a much larger share. I think there's a lot of scope for reducing wasteful expenditures, and that I also believe completely in the fact that there should be exemptions for the poor on say VAT for basic foodstuffs and items like that, right? So I mean, I completely take that point, and I really would urge all actors who care, civil society, students, others, to monitor those expenditures, hold governments to account, and raise your voices, and that in some countries there's the ability to raise your voices more than others, and I think that's an important part that we didn't discuss this time. So that's what I want to say. And then the second thing I want to say more broadly is that I think, if there are, in terms of our diagnosis, in terms of our assessments, in terms of the work that we do, please, do make your voice heard, share them with us. We don't have all the answers to the problems at all. We're just one actor who are trying do some analysis to offer solutions. If you think we're wrong, please share them with us. We are listening. We will listen, and we will take these into account. Because at the end of the day, if somebody else's solution is a better one, that's the one and makes more sense for poor people in whichever country we're talking about. That's the one we will support. It doesn't have to be something that we've come up with. In fact, we would like solutions that are developed jointly, really led by governments, led by the people in the country, and then we will try to provide financing and knowledge support to that, so that it's truly owned. And so I just want to stress that. And finally, that we are open, as we discussed before, to having more such dialogues, and not necessarily myself, but including myself, but others as well, if you want to delve into very specific country-specific issues as well. With that, I really just want to thank you, Professor Akwe, for organizing this. It has really been a pleasure to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. So on this note, we come to the end of another edition of Sankofa African Series. I want to say a very big thank you to Dr. Hassan, to Dr. Nyaramba, Alba in Nairobi, and Andrew, I think, should be in Washington, D.C. So we hope we'll keep engaging, right? But we wish you a happy Labor weekend from the US. We don't know what is happening over there in Nairobi, but I wish you all the best and safety over there in Nairobi. So on this edition, we'll come to end of another edition of Sankofa African Series. We hope to see you next week. So enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You too. Thank you.